In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil faraja. Brothers, sisters, respected viewers, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. And welcome once again after a long hiatus and break, unplanned break from our series. Inshallah, we are back, and inshallah, this time we resume for good our series Life, the Islamic Answer, where we are trying to extract and understand the principles of living Islamically based on the original scriptures of our religion. We are still in the first theme of this series, that is knowledge and reason in Islam. And we had discussed the importance of knowledge and reason, that the alternative, ignorance and foolishness, jahl, is not an alternative in our religion, not an acceptable alternative. And therefore we must engage with what we consider to be knowledge and reason. And we said for anything to be considered knowledge and reason in our religion, it must meet two criteria. The criteria are sincerity, ikhlas, and that it leads to action, that we engage in amal once we know. And we explored both of these notions, these Islamic notions, very important Islamic notions of amal and ikhlas, in numerous lectures. And once this was done, this meant that we can now move into action, and this starts by becoming learners ourselves and starting our journey to acquire this knowledge, this Islamic knowledge that we have been talking about. And so we started to talk about the learner in Islam from all the angles that we thought relevant. And slowly we started to see that this is going to force us to move beyond the learner. And so we moved towards the teacher. And we said that as soon as we start to acquire any knowledge, we are in a position to share that knowledge with others, in addition to the individual responsibility that it has to transform us and that we have to move to action ourselves. Part of the action is also that we have to find ways to share the knowledge that we acquire with others. And the moment we are in that situation, in that role, this means that we are now in the position of the teacher or the scholar. And we said that, of course, there are many degrees. It's a very relative, very broad notion, this notion of the scholar or the teacher in Islam. And so we looked at that notion in detail. Those two, the learner and the teacher, are going to start to form some of the key pieces for something even broader, which is the community. And this brought us to start discussing the community that comes together around knowledge. Not just any community. This is a community that goes beyond coming together around something perhaps more generic or more general or more common. For instance, belief in general. We come together as a community around belief together. That is the main ingredient that brings us together. That's a possibility. And we saw that there is a very broad sense of community. It can be as broad as we are all human beings. That's a community. Or the people of the book. That's a community. That's a very broad community. Or all of those who have accepted the prophethood of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. That's a general community. Or all those who follow the leadership and the imamah of Imam Ali alayhi salam, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. That's a community. And this is what allowed us to say that there are communities within the community. In fact, there are many, many of them. And we spent a few lectures discussing this notion, looking at it from the Quranic verses to establish the notion of the community within the community based on specific criteria. One of those criteria is the community of knowledge, a community that comes together around knowledge. And we said this is perhaps not a notion that we're generally accustomed to hearing about, but that it exists and we are able to establish it from the verses of the Holy Quran, in addition to the numerous ahadith, numerous narrations that we have been going throughout the series. And so this started us on a path of discussions around who belongs to this community. So of course there's the learner, and of course there's a teacher. But beyond them, there are also categories of people that we thought are worth exploring in a little bit more detail, either because they have been mentioned explicitly and specifically in our teachings, in our Islamic teachings, one, or two, because we think that there's a lot more relevance to us to look into them a little bit more. So some of those include, for instance, the youth or the children. Within the community of knowledge, there is a special place given to the youth or the children. Another one that we thought was very important to mention is the role of women in a community of knowledge, because there may be a lot of misunderstanding or confusion around this role of the woman. Can women play this role? To what extent? How is it compatible with the other roles that we consider to be traditionally Islamic roles? Is it compatible with acquiring knowledge and acquiring expertise and knowledge and so on and so forth? And so we spent a few lectures discussing that. Then we talked about the idea of the family as a full unit. We're now no longer looking at members of the family, but the family as a whole unit being part of the community of knowledge. And we emphasize the importance of this for the sustainability, for the perpetuity of the community of knowledge in the future, that we need families to be part of this. Before even going into all of these, we said that the community of knowledge should have enough room and should welcome everyone in the community of knowledge. And we saw the ahadith around this, the emphasis from the Holy Prophet ﷺ and the ahadith from the Imams ﷺ, in that everyone needs to belong to this type of community, to come together. We saw the ahadith talking about once a week, in person, to be someone who is teaching, and if you can't teach, you learn, and if you can't rule, you listen. You're one of those who listens in, or at least to be a lover of those who do all of this. One way or another, you have to belong to that community and be supportive of that community. We said the last role or the last figure or the last member of the community of knowledge that we wanted to look at, once again, we thought something very important to discuss, unfortunately not discussed enough in our contexts, in our communities ourselves, is the intellectual. And we started, and this is I think our fourth discussion, our fourth lecture, about the intellectual in the community of knowledge, in the Islamic community of knowledge. We explained that the majority of us today, when we look at our communities, the majority of us are not experts in religion. That puts us outside a traditional role of leadership in these types of communities. And our role does not seem to be very clear. If we are not the experts in religion, what is our role? We generally support informally. We may or may not want to support in whatever way we can, but can we look at it a little bit more closely, especially from the angle of the intellectual? And we said the intellectual is anyone who is ready to engage with Islam, with religion, with what is relevant to the community at an intellectual level. You don't need to have expertise, even though expertise might be very welcome, and your expertise might be completely outside of religion. Your expertise might be in economics, your expertise might be in medicine, your expertise might be somewhere else. It's an expertise outside of religion. but you are ready to engage with this religion intellectually and with the topics and the issues that are relevant to the community intellectually. So this is our very broad definition of the intellectual. If we want to be a lot more precise, then we would define it a lot more. We don't have time to do that. This would require a much lengthier discussion. So we're keeping it general and we're keeping it broad because we want to extract some practical conclusions from this discussion that are relevant to us, inshallah. We said that depending on where this discussion takes us, this might fundamentally force us to rethink how our communities are structured and the different roles that we play in them. And perhaps what we consider to be, just a matter of I feel like volunteering or I feel like not volunteering in a community center or in a mosque or in a religious community, it might be a lot more prescriptive in our religion. There might be a lot more of an expectation from our religion to play an active role than to think that this is completely, entirely left on us, as though our religion is neutral about this. That if you feel like it, you can do it, but if you don't feel like it, it's fine that you don't participate, you don't contribute, you don't play leadership roles in these types of communities when you have something outside of the expertise, the religious expertise. You have something else to contribute. Is it completely left up to you, or does religion say something a little bit more direct about all of this? And so this forced us to start looking at the notion of the intellectual in society in general and to see how it may help us understand this discussion from the perspective of the Islamic community of knowledge. And we said before we focus on what Islam has said, we said that this is a topic that has not been directly addressed. If we look at Islamic texts, it is not addressed specifically in this way, explicitly. So it requires a little bit of field work, as we can call it, right? We need to go and explore and study and discuss, and we cannot claim that we have found the answer, the solution, black on white, given to us. We have to do the work for it and come up with a proposal or a recommendation that we may follow, that the community may want to adopt. This is really what we try to do in these types of situations, including the fact that this whole notion of the intellectual is entirely new. This is not something that existed. If you go back centuries ago, you wouldn't be able to ask in our Islamic community, who are the intellectuals? Today you can. Today you can look after the fact and say, we would put so-and-so people with so-and-so characteristics and traits, we would put them in this category that today we have created called the intellectual. At that time, that category didn't exist. And that's why this was not a real issue that people needed to discuss and think about and study and come up with answers to. What is the role of the intellectual? Because they had no intellectuals. They were not confronted to the same realities that we have today. And inshallah, this is going to become a lot more clear when we get to the discussion around what Muslim thinkers have said about this. So, this forced us to start looking at the notion of the intellectual. Where did it come from? And we saw that it did not come from the general context, the general background of Islam. It came from the West. It was in Europe initially that they were confronted with this notion of the intellectual initially. And so this forced us to go to that point in time and to start following the progression of this notion and what the West, meaning the main thinkers, the major thinkers in the West, had to say about this notion of the intellectual. And we saw that there were clear shifts and changes happening in society that were leading to the emergence of this notion. It did not exist before and now it exists. What happened? Why does it exist? Did someone just decide to create it? No. It was in reaction to very major transformations that took place in society that suddenly it forced people to look at the world in which they live in a very different way. Truth came from somewhere else now. Power was coming from somewhere else now. It used to be God and revelation and religion, and now it became the human being and reason and science, right? We said that that was a change in the West that forced a complete transformation in what we call the worldview. The worldview changed. Now we're living in a different world than we were before this revolution started. I mean, conceptually, a different world. So you're getting rid of the role of the church, you're getting rid of the role of the monarchy, and so on and so forth. And you're replacing them with human beings that people are choosing. They represent them, democracy. And instead of saying there's a prescribed law that is given to us from God, from above, we're going to come up with our own laws for ourselves. We're going to agree together on what those laws are going to be. We're going to enshrine them and accept them and pass them. There's going to be bills presented by people and others are going to accept them. This is a new order. And so there are people who can play key roles in all of this. Hence the emergence of the intellectual. This is where the intellectual starts to appear, in that kind of world. And so we started to follow the big major changes that started to take place in that world. And we saw very important milestones. We went through a number of them. The Industrial Revolution, the two world wars. We looked at all the way starting from the Enlightenment in Europe, coming all the way to the very digital economies and globalization of today's world. And we said that at each one of these instances, at each one of these milestones, there was very clearly an important role expected of the intellectual. And that role was shifting. And at different milestones, there were different expectations. And we also started to see that not everybody was in agreement. So while some thinkers were taking the intellectual in one place, they expected certain things from the intellectual to fit a certain model. Others wanted the intellectual to be something very different. We saw that very clearly throughout that progression. That's what happened in the West. And I'm not going to go back through everything that we said, the main milestones that we mentioned, and the details that we mentioned there. On the other side, we said the Islamic world was not immune to all of this. A lot of this was starting, all these major socio-economic, historical, other changes, even religious changes taking place in the West, were having very direct impacts on the Islamic world. To the point where it became crucially important in the Islamic world itself to start asking the same questions, and that's exactly what we saw. That in the Islamic world, they started to ask the questions about who is the intellectual and what is the role of the intellectual, what does the intellectual do, what is the intellectual actually doing, versus what is the intellectual supposed to be doing in this type of society. And when we looked at the milestones, we saw that they're different. And it's normal. Islam is coming with a very different baggage. Islam is coming with a very different background. At some point, it was considered to be the height of civilization. And then it started to collapse. And then it maintained itself. And then this brought it all the way to, at some point, the Ottoman Empire. And then the Ottoman Empire started to collapse. And this meant that in the Islamic world, you no longer all, as Muslims, all of you belong to one Islamic empire. Because now it's starting to collapse. And you have the Western, the European powers coming in, starting to colonize and expand their empire into yours. So you become colonies, you become parts of their tradition. They change your ways, they change your thinking, they change your systems. You were accustomed to certain things. All of this is now changing. The way laws are enshrined and applied in society, the languages that are used, the religion that is expected of everyone, the morality that derives out of that, the education systems, all of this started to change in the Islamic world after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And this started to force the Muslims to rethink what happened to us. What suddenly happened that we now find ourselves playing catch up? What happened that now the Europeans are the ones dominating in all the important areas from this point of view, especially from the point of view of development, industrial, economic, so on and so forth, that led to military domination, that led to cultural domination eventually. What is happening? So this starts with, right from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, you start to see the literature, the writing of Muslim thinkers start to move in that direction. And this continues all the way until today. And there are events that perhaps were not the same. There were things that happening in the West that were not directly impacting the Islamic world, or not directly impacting it in the same way, leading to the same types of questions about who is the intellectual and what is their role, but they were still having impacts. You can no longer say that this was a complete world, distinct, separate, autonomous, independent of what was happening in the West. Now everything was starting to be more and more intertwined. What was happening here was affecting what's happening there. And so we went through the major milestones in the Islamic world too, all the way to, the two world wars, the before and after of colonization, that many of these groups of people started to become nations. What does it mean to be a nation? What is the role of the intellectual in a nation? And so on and so forth, coming all the way down once again to globalization, even to the Arab Springs, if we want to bring it all the way down to the more recent years. What is the role of the intellectual in all of this? And we said that if we go back over the past perhaps 150 years, even more, there are pretty much no major Islamic thinkers who have not addressed this issue, who have not written about it, who have not lectured about it. Some of them have written multiple volumes and multiple works on this. But one way or another, if you are a Muslim thinker concerned with the state of Islam, with the state of the general community of Muslims, then at some point you're going to be confronted with this question. What is the role of the educated, non-expert in the Islamic world? You're not an expert in religion, you're not an expert in Islam, but you have a background, you have an education. What is your role? Should you have a role? What does that look like? This is kind of the discussion that we had until now. And we said that there's a way to draw parallels between the milestones, between the progression that happened in the West and the progression that happened in the Islamic world. Up to here, things are more or less clear. Where it starts to get nebulous and a little bit less clear is for people like us. So now, you fast forward and you come to the past couple of generations where you have people from the Islamic world who leave the Islamic world for whatever reason, and they end up in the Western world. And now they are trying to create their own communities. And in that world, we cannot just look at them as belonging to Western society, because they come with an Islamic background and an Islamic heritage. And we cannot just look at them as being Muslims, because they are very much affected by the Western societies and the Western background in which they live. And now we are therefore forced to deal with a situation by keeping in mind that the West has its own history and heritage and tradition around this whole notion of the intellectual that has led, all of this has led to this point in time. And the Muslim Islamic world also has its own history and its own background and its own heritage, and it went through its own transformations and milestones, where today you would understand why a Muslim thinker in the Islamic world would be writing what they're writing. Because they are in that type of world, in that society, in an Islamic society that has gone through all of this. But for those, as communities, we're not talking about individuals, as communities, minority communities of Muslims living in the West, neither one of these two scenarios is going to apply fully. They are not entirely Westernized, and they are not entirely Islamic. They are a mix of this and that. They live in a Western reality, and they carry a lot of Islamic elements. From that angle, we have to confront the reality that this is a novel phenomenon. This is a new reality. What does it look like in this type of environment to ask this question? And our argument is that it's perhaps even more important to ask this question specifically in this type of environment. As important as it may be to ask it for Islamic societies living in the Islamic world, in the world that is dominantly Muslim, it is even more important to ask this question for those who are living in situations outside and away from the Muslim world. And they are still trying to be Islamic communities, and we add this characteristic of knowledge. Islamic communities of knowledge. This is our concern. And maybe I'll make a very quick note here before we go into what we discussed. The note is that I've received, I think, very positive, encouraging feedback since we started, especially, yes, talking about the community in general, but specifically about the intellectual, with a lot of interest, a lot of appetite, asking to go much deeper into some of these topics. To go through, for instance, an exploration of the history of ideas, of the evolution of philosophical thought, and the dominant ideologies that we find in the West, and all of that. And it's promising and it's encouraging and the interest is amazing. But there's a lot of issues with that. One is that this is not the place for it. We are in a small subtopic in a much bigger theme, and we're only addressing this to cover that little subtopic. We're not providing here a full philosophical excursion of all of the big names in philosophy and all of the big schools of thought and how they interacted with each other and how they reacted to each other. We're not doing that. All we're doing is picking and choosing some schools of thought, some thinkers here and there, to give samples of where the West gave a lot more attention to the notion of the intellectual. That's all we're doing. Everything we said was to give the background to this and the context to this. Otherwise, if we wanted to understand those other questions, either we would need crash courses, summarized specific lectures on those, and inshallah, we can do that if there's interest. Or, if we wanted to be serious about it, this would require a series where we'd do a much deeper dive into some of these thinkers because they have been so influential, to explore their thought, how their thought has affected others, who influenced them, what does it mean for us today, is it relevant or not? All of that would require a lot more discussion than we're trying to do here, and it's not relevant to what we're trying to do. In itself, we're not saying that it's not important, but we are moving in a series on knowledge and reason in Islam. And within knowledge and reason in Islam, we said that one of the headings is the community of knowledge. We're only talking about the intellectual as part of the community of knowledge, as part of the general theme of knowledge and reason in Islam. And this is constantly creating the tension that we have been having since the beginning of the series. So on the one side, there is eagerness, I'm not going to say impatience, there's eagerness to keep moving, to get to the end of this theme. This theme has lasted for a long time, knowledge and reason. And we said this is just theme one of perhaps around a dozen themes, to cover as much of Islamic teachings as we can in a systematic way, in a way that tells us here are the Islamic principles to live. So of course, beyond knowledge and reason, we have to explore a lot more of what Islam has to say about very different themes than the one we're currently discussing. And the one we're currently discussing still has a significant amount of content we're trying to get through. We said after this, we want to talk, for instance, about the types of knowledge. What are the types of knowledge that Islam has specifically talked about? We haven't talked about that yet, right? To give one example. So we still have work to do to finish this theme. So on the one side, we're trying to move and not make the series last longer than it should. On the other side, the general experience has been that every time we are getting to a topic and we open that topic, we open that door to see what's behind it, there's a lot of interest to stay there and to go even deeper, right? And this creates a tension. Either we do deeper discussions, which take longer, or we do broader discussions, which means that we move faster, but we don't have enough time to go very deep. And we've been trying to balance both, right? It's impossible to cover everything. So we cover what we can and what we identify and select as being the most important, while being able to say we covered, we discussed and had a complete, fulsome discussion about the topic. We're not really leaving any of the major ideas and major points out, but we can't go any further without really taking away from the speed at which we're trying to move. Okay, so this, I simply wanted to address it, and this is something that, inshallah, we can discuss more in person to see if there are adjustments required to spend more time, less time on certain things, and maybe change how we have been moving forward or not. So where we left things off is that once we went through this full exploration on the Western side of the not only major milestones, and then the major milestones on the Islamic side, we started to look at a number of thinkers and what they had to say about the intellectual. And we were sampling. And we said when we look at all of this, it starts to look like it's overwhelming and all over the place. So at the end, what we try to do is to put all of this together and try to take out a couple of themes that are going to be relevant and useful for us as we move to the discussion on what Muslim thinkers have said. Because all of this is going to be useful for us there. Whether they have talked about it or not, we'll see. But for our own discussion today, we can see that these themes are relevant. These themes are important when we looked at everything we presented. And to make things simple and not to spend too much time, we focused on 3 themes. The first theme, and I believe that we are still in that first theme. We didn't have time to finish it last time. The first theme was power structures. So the 3 themes, if you want to remember them, we said from everything we looked at, the Western thinkers seem to have focused on 3 major themes when it comes to the role of the intellectual. First is the power structures in society and where the intellectual fits into those power structures. The second one had to do with critique and skepticism. And today I'll talk a little bit more about that, inshallah. I'll try to finish them, but we'll see. And the third of these themes is the engagement of the intellectual. How engaged are they, or should they be, in what is happening in society? With this, if you understand these, you have a very good idea of all of the discussions around the intellectual. Okay, these are the major themes that come through when there's a discussion around the intellectual. And inshallah, you see that all three are very relevant for us. So the first one had to do with power structures. So very quickly, we said that there are two thinkers here that we looked at a little bit more closely. And I don't want to spend time too much on either one because I think we covered it. We spoke about Antonio Gramsci. And we said he is considered a Marxist or a neo-Marxist thinker, a thinker who took Marxist thought and added to it. He was politically engaged, very active, to the point where he was taken to jail. And he wrote his works in jail. And that's why his works are called the prison notebooks. Today, if you want to look for his works, I think he left over 30 some works. All of these are called the prison notebooks. In some of his works, he focused his attention on the intellectual. And I'm not going to go through the full discussion that we had. Inshallah, all of that is clear. But there are a couple of notions that became very important in his works, and many of those who have come since his writings, he was writing at the very early stages of the 1900s. They have reused a lot of his notions until today. And perhaps one of his most powerful notions is cultural hegemony. Hegemony is domination and control. How do the power structures impose their domination and control over society? And he explained that this is not done through brute force, through coercion. No one is being forced. The main way that this is done is through a soft power. This is done in a way that you want to follow. You want to do as you are told. You want to act in a certain way. You want to study this field. You want to work in that way. You want to do as you are required to do. Okay, so this was a very important notion in the way he looks at all of this. And of course, his main question then becomes, where does the intellectual fit into all of this? And at the end, he was saying mainly the intellectual, he was being, in a way we can say he was staying neutral, but he was saying the most important thing in all of this, being Marxist, is who is representing which class, which socio-economic class, and the interest of which class. So is the intellectual always representing the class from which they stem? So he was making a difference between the intellectuals who are part of the elites and the traditional intellectuals, the clergy and those who are the elites already. It's already the rich and the powerful who are sending their children to get educated, who come back and they form the intellectuals. It's that socioeconomic class. So of course what comes out of them is always going to protect the powers, so the economic system, the legal system, the education system, to ensure that those systems remain in place. And those who have the power keep the power and get more power, and those who don't have power don't gain access to that power, and so on and so forth. And what about those who are coming from outside of those classes? Well, here's their chance to represent the others. But in a lot of cases, they don't. They fall into the same pattern because of their education. Their education brings them into becoming part of that elite. Okay? This is what his discussion was saying, but he's giving you a lot of tools to start rethinking the role of the intellectual. What are they doing? Who do they represent? Who are they supposed to represent? And so on and so forth. What was interesting here, and this is the point that I'm trying to draw from this, is that regardless of what he's saying about all of this, if you look at his personal life, first of all, we have to say Gramsci was himself an intellectual. And as an intellectual, if we put all of his writings aside, his theories, his abstract notions aside, he was engaged. He was extremely engaged, means he was active. That he did not stay at the level of ideas. That he did something that led to action or acting in the world, trying to change society with action, to the point where he was imprisoned. That means that he went that far, that he took those kinds of risks. So today we would certainly say that as an intellectual, he was a very engaged intellectual, by opposition to others. This is a very important notion. We have to come back to this notion later. Okay, so one, so he was engaged. Two, he was politically active. He created his own political party. He was leading a group of people politically, which is a whole other dimension. This is not just I have general ideas. I'm willing to do something about them, and not just, go and lead a protest, once a week or once a month or once a year. It's I'm working day in and day out on the administration, on the management of all of this, putting it together, creating a political party, changing the system itself. Right? That's what it means. To the point where, as we said, he was imprisoned. But generally speaking, today people, if you would ask them, they wouldn't say that his ideas about the intellectuals are necessarily very positive or very negative. He was describing more or less, one way or another, the role of the intellectual and what they're actually doing in society, while opening the door that you don't need to be an intellectual to be active. That's an important point in his philosophy and in his thinking. He wants to say, don't give them, only to them, those elites, that power. You have that power too, as a citizen, that you can have agency, as it comes to be known. You have the will and the intent, you can actually change the world. You can make changes in the world yourself. Okay? That was Gramsci. Then we went to, we're still under power structures. We said another set of intellectual tools that are very important for us to look at all of this can be drawn from Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault, we're going to talk about him twice. The first one, and I intentionally separate him, the first Foucault that I'm talking about is here under power structures because the majority of the work of Michel Foucault, he was a French philosopher, very influential French philosopher, from the 1920s to the 1980s he lived. The majority of his work was about power structures. A lot of his philosophy is about finding ways to show that there are power structures in place and that most people don't realize that there are these power structures in place. And that a lot of these power structures are only possible because intellectuals participate in them and create them and enforce them and strengthen them. And so you have these power structures and everybody else is just part of them, including the intellectuals. To the point where you think that you have this specialized knowledge, that you know more, that you have more tools, that you have more analysis, that you have more critique as an intellectual. He's saying, in fact, everything that you come up with, everything that is part of your output and your product as an intellectual is only the product of your background and the power structures that made you emerge and generated you. You're only a product of that system. You're nothing more. And he tries to do this by looking at different points in history. The human being is the same human being. So why are they thinking this way here and thinking this way there? The only difference is what happened in society. That type of society and context produced that type of thought. So in that type of thought, this is good and that is bad. You move a few centuries away, and suddenly that thing which was good here is now bad here. What changed? This is an intellectual and this is an intellectual. If it's a truth, they should both agree on it. And yet they're disagreeing on it. The difference, he says, is that they are simply the product of the background that produced them. The social context, the power structures that produce what we called the episteme, the general way that people think. And this applies to everyone, fine, but we're concerned with the intellectual. This applies to the intellectual as well. As an intellectual, you're not immune to this. The way you think and the way you write and the truth that you're presenting to the world is in fact nothing more than the product of the context that is producing you. Right? And so we said that this is the point that we're trying to get out from Foucault. So inshallah, none of this is new. We talked about all of this. This is just a very quick recap. Right? And so he spoke about, for instance, what is science? What determines what is science at a specific point in time? Questions as fundamental as those. What is philosophy? It depends on the context. If you look at different points in history, you'll see that the notion of science changed. Today we take it for granted. This is science. Very clearly, there is no two people will disagree. We all recognize science when we see it. Go back a few centuries ago, you'll see that that wasn't the case. What you're calling science today was not science then. And what they called science, you don't agree that this is science. Which means that there are fundamental ideas that have completely changed. Why? Did someone just sit and decide out of the blue, I'm going to change the way we think about this? No. This is the natural output of the people being produced by a system, by a certain worldview, by a certain way of understanding reality and the world that you live in. And so from all of this, he started to focus, or we focused in his works a little bit more on the idea of how all of this is produced. And you need the intellectuals to produce all of this. You need the language to produce the notions that are used by people who spend a lot of time understanding these notions, talking about these notions, writing about these notions, teaching in these notions, the intellectuals. And so the intellectuals are participants in all of this. They're not special, they're not immune, they're not protected. In fact, so all of this, we can call it this episteme. We can call it the discourse, the general discourse at a given point in time. And he says, in the way he writes, he says that the intellectuals are simply functionaries. A functionary today we would say is a public servant, right? You're someone who works for, you're employed, you're an employer of, you're an employee of an employer. You're a functionary. You perform a function that is given to you. That's it. You're not really there to think. You're there to do and execute as you are being told. They are functionaries of discourse. There's a discourse in place, and they are functionaries of that discourse. They execute. They put it out. They make people understand it. They make people live by it. But they're not special in any other way. And he says this about the intellectuals. So when we look at this, and the type of knowledge that these people are going to create, he says that intellectuals produce knowledge that is always going to conform to the rules, to the norms that even the power structures that produce them. So they perpetuate the same system. And this becomes very important if we want to understand the role of the intellectual. So here, this is what Foucault is saying in general about the notion of the intellectual. He's not telling us really anything about what should the intellectual do. He doesn't really talk about a lot of that. Today, if you pick up some of the books of Foucault, he does talk about the intellectual. But those books were published after he died. They were taken from lectures that he delivered and courses that he delivered, either his notes or transcripts of his lectures, and those were turned into books. And so this is the second Foucault that I will talk about in a second. But the first Foucault was focused on power structures, but he was describing the role of the intellectual in the power structure. And generally, I think we would all agree, there's nothing special, he's saying, about the intellectual. In fact, he's like everybody else, stuck in that type of system, forced to think in a certain way, simply the product of the system that created him or her. So a couple of notes here. The first one is that, and we mentioned this, Foucault is politically active as well. And today we would say on a lot of issues, not everything, but some issues, Foucault was an engaged intellectual. So keep that in mind. One. Two is more of a critical position. Because by the way, we're not presenting any of this, inshallah, this part is clear. We're not presenting any of this to say that any of this is right. We're trying to understand what some of the more influential thinkers in the West had to say about the intellectual. We're not saying any of this is right. There might be portions of this that are useful for us, that we can draw on, take them as tools to be used for our own purposes. We're not saying that this is true, this is correct, this is to be taken as is and applied. We're not saying any of that. Okay, inshallah, this part is clear. Not Gramsci, not Marx, not any of them, right? Foucault, and so on and so forth. But the critical position to this is that this is where you see that they go a little bit too far. A lot of these thinkers, when they generalize. And here Foucault is generalizing. Because otherwise, it would be very easy to say about Foucault's work, well, there's nothing special about you or your work or anything that you're saying either. You are simply the product of the system that produced you, Foucault. And this system that he gives us a tool. He calls it the archaeology of knowledge. It's like a field. You know how we have a field today called archaeology? So you go digging and you try to find artifacts that give you clues that you have to piece together to give you an understanding of the past. Right? Archaeology. He created or tried to create and propose a new field of study called the archaeology of knowledge. He says, I go, and he teaches us how he does it by giving us specific examples. We talked about that a little bit. So he can take, for instance, the medical field. You know, what does it mean today to look at something like psychiatry? What does psychiatry consider to be madness? He takes the notion of madness and he explores it through history. How was madness looked at throughout history, all the way down to today? And through this, he shows us how he does his work. He says, if you take this and apply it elsewhere, now you have the tool so that you do not fall. You step outside of the episteme of your time. I'm giving you the tool. I'm giving you the system. I'm giving you the field of study that will open the door, and you are no longer going to be the product of the system that generates you. You are going to be above all of this by using the archaeology of knowledge. So he's saying, I'm special and I have the answer. And this is how this is done. But if everything he's saying is true, then what is not to say that everything that he's saying is simply in reaction to the world that he lived in, the experiences that he had, and the power structures and the systems that produced him to give us the archaeology of knowledge. Why would this be above and beyond and immune to all the rest? Right? In any case, we leave that to another time. That's the first theme. Second theme. The second theme has to do with the thinkers or the works of those thinkers, because sometimes some thinkers have multiple works, or in some works they have different angles. right? We're focusing on specific angles here. We want to focus now on critique and skepticism. Critique and skepticism of the role of the intellectual in society. And that's a theme. And we see that there's a number of thinkers who, when they spoke about the intellectuals, and we already saw hints of that, they were critical of the intellectual. Either critical because of what the intellectuals were actually doing, when we look at how they behave in society. So I'm looking at actual cases and actual behavior, or in general, without even looking at specific cases, in general, when I think about the notion of the intellectual. And we're going to see some of the reasons why. But a lot of the thinkers who have looked at the role of the intellectual, and they've written about it and thought about it and analyzed it, they've been critical or at least skeptical. They say we have to have a lot of hesitation. Don't jump too far into, don't get too excited about following the intellectuals and listening to what they have to say and putting into execution their ideas. Take your time and be careful for all sorts of reasons. Okay, so this is what we're looking at now. The first one is called Paul Johnson. I think I forgot. I grabbed his book on the way out and I think I forgot it. Paul Johnson was a historian and he wrote a book. He wrote more than one work about this, but he has a book very well known called Intellectuals, where in every chapter he's looking at, intellectuals, very famous intellectuals in human history, and he looks at them. So he's presenting, today we would say simply a biography of that intellectual, but he's trying to achieve something very specific from that biography, so there's a twist in how he presents it. At the end, he has a skeptical or critical view. He looks at what this person does in their field, outside their field, what their life looks like. And he says, first, it's clear that these people have had a great influence. So one way to understand why intellectuals are important and worth our time is that if you compare someone who falls in this category with someone else, you'll see that they have a lot more influence. They affect a lot more people. They change the world a lot more than the typical human being. They do have a lot more influence. We have to give that to them. 1. 2, and this is the line that I think summarizes everything. He says, intellectuals are brilliant and magnetic. So there's 2 traits here. Both of them are very important. They're brilliant, so there is an intellectual capacity that they have. They are brilliant, and they are magnetic. Whether it's because of their brilliance or other reasons, they attract people to them. They attract people to their ideas, which makes them influential, which means that people are interested in what they have to say, how they think, what they write, and then go and do, or live their lives based on what the intellectual is saying or doing or telling others how to live by or live like. So, but there's a second half to that line. He says intellectuals are brilliant and magnetic, but also contradictory and dangerous. He says if we look closely, we see that all of these great figures and intellectuals, they in fact contradict themselves all the time. We just seem to focus on certain things and not others. But if we would look at everything, and this is what he does in their biographies, we would look at specific things, we'll see that they're full of contradictions. Even in those things that they're famous for, we see that they contradict themselves in them. But from the outside, not knowing or not caring about those other things, we tend to focus on one aspect, one dimension, and make it a lot more influential, and they are dangerous. They can lead to disastrous results, those intellectuals. Because of their brilliance and because they are so magnetic, they are also dangerous. So he says they often lead to dangerous and, in fact, destructive outcomes. Because they have a lot more influence. When the typical human being makes a mistake, their reach in the world is very limited. The mistake is going to impact them. It might impact a few people around them. When this intellectual makes a mistake, it might impact hundreds, thousands, millions of people. And so this is what he tries to show. Because there are too many examples to list. So can they be dangerous? Yes, they can be. And this is where he adds, especially, and this is extremely important to us, especially when they assume roles outside of their areas of expertise. This is an intellectual. They're brilliant. They must be brilliant in everything, right? If they are brilliant in math, they must be brilliant in everything. I will also take advice from them on politics. They are brilliant in history, world famous for some of their historical ideas. And they also have very strong feelings about medicine. And I might take their position about medicine. They might even have written books about medicine, even though medicine is outside of their field. They have lectured about it. They've talked about it. They constantly come up on TV talking about other areas outside of their field of expertise. Okay? So therefore, he says, in conclusion, we need to be very careful and to scrutinize, he says, their morals and their character, which is very interesting, not only their expertise and their ideas. What kind of people are they and how do they live their lives also tells us something about them. And whether they are the type of people who have the morals to say, this is outside my field, I'm not competent in this, I shouldn't be talking about this, my opinion is worth the same opinion as yours in this field because I'm not an expert. Here I've studied. I have 20 years on you here. So yes, my opinion is worth something. I have something useful to share with you here. Here, you and I are the same. You shouldn't be taking anything special from me. Right? So we have to look at, he says, their morals and their character and not just their expertise and their ideas. So that's generally what he says. And that's what we mean. This is a good example of, this is a general theme. This general theme of the critical position, or at least the skeptical position towards intellectuals. The second one is, I'm just looking at the time to see what we can cover. The second example in this theme of critical or skeptical towards the intellectuals is a thinker. Yeah, we can call him a thinker. He's an economist. His name is Thomas Sowell. He's American. He's still alive. He was born in 1930, very famous, and he has a good presence on YouTube and elsewhere today. His name is Thomas Sowell. Very interesting thinker. He has a good number of books, and he definitely writes like an intellectual, but also like an economist. It's very clear, very incisive language, and he has been in the news because some of his positions and opinions have been a little controversial, especially about race and ethnicity and privilege and all of that, because he's African American in any case. So very much worth at least knowing about him, Thomas Sowell. So he has a work called Intellectuals and Society that was published in 2010. It's been republished, but it was published in 2010, Intellectuals and Society. He says intellectuals are those people whose end products are ideas. So how do you define what an intellectual is? He says the intellectual is someone who produces ideas and nothing more. This means that in his world, and by his definition, someone like an engineer, for instance, is not an intellectual. Why? Because let's say this is a civil engineer. He says a civil engineer, what they produce in the world is, for instance, a building. And the building can have, and this is the point he's trying to make, the building can have real impact and consequences in the world. For instance, it could collapse or not. It's something tangible, right? This is very different than someone who only produces an idea, something that stays at the level of ideas. And this is going to become a lot clearer a little bit later. He says that intellectuals are part of the elites, just like those who are very rich and those who hold political power and others. They are part of the elites, and they consider themselves to have been, he uses this term, and I'll come back to it. He has a full book on it. I'm talking about one book, but he has another book about this. He says they have been anointed. An anointment is when you're being recognized. It's a ritual to recognize you as part of a select group of people. You've been anointed, promoted selectively into a group of people. Intellectuals have been anointed. They are endowed with superior intellect than the masses, and they are special. That's not the issue. The issue is they think this of themselves very much, and they exaggerate this. In what way? One, they shape public opinion and policy. And I'll come back to this point of policy and public opinion, because this is really his focus. He's concerned with policy and policy making and running a country. Okay? So they shape public opinion and policy without bearing the responsibility or the consequences of their ideas. The intellectual may have an idea, a theory. They write a book about it. They go on tour and they give lectures about this. People listen to it. The world changes because of this. A new policy has come in place to match this expert's, this intellectual's ideas. And it flops completely, was completely wrong. It goes in the wrong way. He says this is going to generate wealth in society, and it leads to economic collapse in a community. Is anyone going to come back to this intellectual and say, these are the consequences of your ideas, therefore? No, there is no therefore. There are no consequences to the intellectual. That's why he says they do not bear the consequences of their ideas. And they live in the world of ideas. They don't produce anything tangible. People turn what they say into tangible things. But they do not produce anything tangible. And they seem not to be responsible for those ideas. 1. 2, critical of disconnect between, he is critical of the disconnect between ideas and real world consequences. So that he says there's an isolation from the practical outcomes. There's no accountability. If it goes well, he might say, oh, it went well because of me. If it doesn't go well, no one is going to come back and say, but this was your idea. Which is, of course, maybe a little bit of an exaggeration. Because usually there are some consequences. Even in the world of ideas, this person does lose status. And people will say, but this was a mistake. It's not the same level. It's not practical in the same way. True. So he might be going a little bit too far here, but this is the general idea. And then he says they are experts. They are specialists. But their area of specialization is usually extremely narrow. They might know a lot, and not even everything, but they may know a lot about a tiny thing. But that tiny thing is usually incomplete. That's not even the full phenomenon to be known to have a full opinion on. For instance, economy. No one's an expert in economy. You're an expert in aspects of it, cases of it, dimensions of it, not everything in economy. And yet, you present yourself to the world, or the world accepts you as an expert in all of it. Or things like, like understanding, for instance, the workings of a plane. There are people, and this is where he goes into the real world consequences, their knowledge of it is a lot more comprehensive than yours, but you're the intellectual, and they are the ones who understand how it works at the practical level, in the real world. He knows what happens when the wheel comes out or doesn't come out as the plane is landing. He uses that example. Because in this case, it's going to crash or not crash. Okay? And so he says, because of the narrow and specialized knowledge, they are not qualified to influence public opinion if they have not demonstrated expertise in those areas. We all have to agree that you have shown to have expertise in an area before you share your opinions about what should be done in that area. He calls it verbal virtuosity. Someone who is able to speak very well and use language very well in a very convincing way. To be an intellectual, of course, you should be able to do that. And of course, you're going to be a lot more convincing than someone else. Someone else who might have very valid, very important knowledge, but yours will always come before because of everything else and because you are able to use language in a much more convincing way. With further reaching consequences in society. And this does not always mean that this is because you have evidence and logic on your side. If you do, great, that's what we need. But it doesn't mean that you necessarily have it. You can use language to compensate for lack of evidence. There are people who can be very convincing, even though there's no evidence at all that they're presenting. And they're using flawed logic. That's why you study fallacies. Sophisms, as they call them, in critical thinking, in philosophy. They say that these are fallacies or sophisms. You're using language to show that you are very convincing, that your argument makes sense, that this is the absolute truth, when in reality it's full of mistakes and shortcomings. But if you know how to use language and you add a bit of charisma and you know how to present it, it's very convincing. You need a bit of confidence and that's all. Disproportionate influence on public opinion. And so we give them all the power. They deserve a tiny bit that matches their expertise. But we give them a whole lot more, which means that they can influence a lot more. And that's exactly what ends up happening. And so his focus is, now he goes case after case of economic collapse and crises and catastrophes and wrong decisions and policies and laws and projects that all fail because we relied on experts who are not really experts in those opinions, but they shared those opinions and things happened because of it, and there were no real consequences to the experts. The experts moved on to be experts in other fields and with more ideas and with more books and with more lectures and so on and so forth. But there were real life consequences to other people. There are people who lost their homes and who lost millions and who lost, projects, and the intellectual moves on, right? So he says, must therefore be grounded in solid empirical data and evidence, not abstract theories. And so he's very critical of people like Bertrand Russell, like Noam Chomsky. When asked, about them, he'll say, what do you think about Noam Chomsky's writings as a linguist? He'll say he's a genius. Politics, he calls it pure or complete absurdity. It's not his field. He should stay in linguistics. He's a linguist. He should stay in linguistics. He has nothing to say, no place to talk about politics at all. Of course, Chomsky would completely disagree, but we're explaining what Thomas Sowell says. Okay, and so I think the way he presents all of this, it's a little extreme. He goes a little bit too far in the way that he presents it because it becomes very reductionist. It's not entirely true that there's absolutely no accountability. He might be looking at accountability from a specific angle, but in the world of ideas, that's not the angle that matters. In the world of ideas, there's a status that is gained or lost. When your idea makes sense, more people accept it. When it becomes proven, people accept you more. You gain more status because of that. And if that idea doesn't make sense or doesn't go anywhere, it's not influential, this is what matters in that world. As opposed to, for instance, whether the building stands or not in the material world. This has its own criteria, that has its own criteria. That's one. Secondly, he seems to present in a lot of ways his ideas as though it is not possible for someone to have expertise in more than one field. So let's say, just as an example, Chomsky has now written, let's say, 50 or more books on politics. At what point do you say that this person is now an expert? When they've been doing this for, let's say, 50 years. Can you simply say that because they didn't study 4 years in university, that this was entirely and completely irrelevant, and he's incompetent, and he has no expertise? Or is there maybe another agenda? What if what this expert in other fields, for instance Chomsky, to take him as an example, let's say Chomsky has absolutely no competence, and we can't establish his competence outside of his linguistics, let's say in politics. But what if those ideas that he's presenting in politics completely match the ideas of those you do consider to be experts? In that case, do we recognize his expertise or not? And this is all assuming that these are two completely separate fields. Otherwise, the truth is, the way Chomsky came into politics, if you look at his trajectory, to take one example, but just to say like things are not always so black and white. Chomsky made his name with manufacturing consent, right? So it became a documentary, it was a book, it became a documentary, and the idea that you are able to get consent, to get the approval of your citizenry, of your citizens, through the way that you present the truth to them. So this is the whole truth, but you never show them the whole truth. You decide to hide some parts, and you bring your attention to certain parts, and through that, you get them to see what you want them to see and not to see the rest. And of course, they're going to be very happy with you and how you are managing and how you are running the state. Right? This is what he does. This is what Chomsky did. So, in manufacturing consent, if you haven't seen it, you should go watch it. Right? And you see the work that he does. The work that he does is based on linguistics and communication. He's showing how communication, how language is used to manufacture consent, to get the approval of your citizens because of the way you use language. Is he in his field or not? As a linguist, as an expert in communication, he's still within his field. He's simply applying his field to someone else's field. Today, he's applying it to politics. Tomorrow, he might apply it to engineering. It doesn't matter. He's still within his field. He might be able to say very relevant things in his field, even though he doesn't have a degree that says he studied political science. For instance, just to take an example and reduce it and simplify it. Okay? So, I think, regardless and nonetheless, what he is saying is still extremely interesting and very relevant to us. Because Thomas Sowell is talking about this idea that there are those who only think. So let's take away names and take away specific instances. The core of his idea is that he is critical of those who only have ideas. And there are no real consequences to any of their ideas. And this can become very dangerous. And this does require some skepticism and perhaps even being critical if we want to really add the religious lens that we already added. And we said in our religion, knowledge means action. You're acting based on the knowledge. Yet there are those who are only good at speech. There's only theories, and there's critique, and there is if they did this, and if they didn't do that, and okay, but what are you doing about it? Show us your work so that we know what you mean, so that we have something concrete to talk about and to look at and to criticize or appreciate, right? In any case. And so maybe a last couple of points regarding Thomas Sowell, and then I'll end with maybe one more thinker, and I'll go quickly there. This work was part of a trilogy. This was the third work, the Intellectuals and Society. This was the third work. The first one was A Conflict of Visions. And the second one was The Vision of the Anointed. So I mentioned the anointed at the beginning. He says the intellectuals are those who have been anointed. You've been recognized and selected and promoted into the elites. You're special. The previous book was The Vision of the Anointed. And the book before that one was A Conflict of Visions. So now we start to understand how he built his argument over the years, because it started in the 80s, right? And now he published this one in 2010. A Conflict of Visions, he says there are two ways to see the world. There's the constricted and the unconstricted way. The constricted way is that you only see the world through the traditional way that you have been taught to see the world, to simplify it. And the unconstricted is kind of like the open, unlimited way to see the world, is when you are open to being educated and you are open to learning about the world. You're constantly willing to re-examine how you look at the world. In that case, you have an unconstricted view of the world because you can constantly re-educate yourself about it. Okay, it stopped there. So there's kind of a tunnel vision, very narrow way of looking at the world, and then there's the open way of looking at the world. That was really the point of that first book. The second book, The Vision of the Anointed. Now he's going after the elites. And here he says, those who view themselves as morally superior, okay, for being the elites. They are the elites. They're already the elites. But they think that they are morally superior. They should be the elites. They should be listened to more than others. They do deserve the power that is given to them. But he says they only deserve a bit of power. The amount of power that is because of a demonstrated expertise, specialization. That's the amount of power they should have. But no, they think that they should have a lot more because they have been anointed. They have made it to the elites. One, they live in a world of self-congratulation. It's all based on their beliefs and their confidence in themselves, as opposed to the real outcomes of their ideas and everything that they have been given under their influence. That's two. And three, this is a point that he always makes, the unanointed have the real practical knowledge. Those who are outside of those elites are generally those who have the real practical knowledge. They are the ones going through the cases. They are the ones who are going through the reality. And yet we still continue to give the power and the recognition to those who are more in the elites, who are usually detached from the reality of what is happening, the actual cases, the specific instances. Okay, and so his focus, and maybe this is where you see that perhaps it's a shortcoming of the way he works, or for us, let's not talk about him, for us perhaps it could make it less relevant if we say that his focus, even though he talks in these very general terms, his focus is really policy making and running a country. So he tends to focus on those cases where bad decisions in policy making that relied on experts led to disasters, for instance. So this might not be generalizable to every field and every area of life. Okay? The other thing is, for those who know, there's another thinker, Nassim Taleb. This one is, he's very well known, especially in the business world and elsewhere. He has a number of books. One of his, because some of these ideas come back in more than one book, but he has a book by the name of Skin in the Game, or something of that line. The point of that book to me reminds me a lot of the same type of thinking that we find in Thomas Sowell, which is that there are people who give you advice and make recommendations and say what to do and what not to do. And sometimes he talks about consultants in that way, right? You run a company, you need a consultant, the consultant comes in, they do a study, they give you a report with 3 recommendations and they leave. And so now you do as the report says and you apply it exactly like it does, and the company goes bankrupt. Are they accountable? Are they responsible? Is anyone going to go back after them and say your recommendations were good or bad? No. He received his paycheck as a consultant. He comes in, he does his thing, and he leaves. That's why he calls his book Skin in the Game. Do you have skin in the game? When your ideas lose, do you lose? And when your ideas are doing well, are you doing well? Do you really have a reason, a really good reason for making sure that your ideas and what you're saying is true? And that what you're saying is not wrong? What's your driver? Because you can really say anything because you've already been recognized as an expert. So you could say anything. So what's the real reason pushing you, driving you to make sure that what you're going to say is truthful? And this is a very interesting notion in our world of religion too. Really, does it come back or come down to just your moral character? Or could there be more? Okay, so to me, the ideas we find in Thomas Sowell remind me a lot of, for those, because he's a bestseller, and I know a lot of people read a lot of his books, Skin in the Game and others. Nassim Taleb, he talks about this too. The Black Swan. The Black Swan is completely different, right? A black swan is an event that happens that was kind of completely unexpected, and it's how do you react to something like that, right? And now there's a whole number of other books that have appeared in that world, in the business world, with animals and their colors, right? In any case, that's a whole different world. The last one I wanted to talk about, and I won't take too long about this, but again, I think because of the interest, and I'm mentioning some of these because of the interest, I thought at least I mentioned some of the big names. For some people, it might be at least a reason for them to know who this person is and some of their influential ideas. It's an excuse for me to talk about them quickly. And they did really have things to say about this topic that we're talking about, the intellectual. The next one is Albert Camus, or in French, Albert Camus, right? He's a French Algerian philosopher, thinker, playwright, writer, journalist who lived quite a short life, but was extremely influential, and he won the Nobel Prize for his writing. His writing is considered, or he was very preoccupied with today what we would call existentialism, the human condition, the absurdity of life, the lack of meaning, whether there is meaning, like the struggle of the human being to find meaning in life, things like that. And always struggling also with the world of indifference, right? As soon as we say absurdity, it's like, does anyone care that, the misery that the human condition is in, is there different, is it all indifference and apathy, or does anyone really genuinely care to the point of wanting to do something about it? And is there anything to be done about it? Okay, so this is existentialist philosophy in any case. And so he wrote a number of works, and some of them are quite considered, literary masterpieces in the way he writes. And as we said, he won the Nobel Prize in the 1950s for it. So he has a work by the name or by the title of The Rebel, or translated as The Rebel, L'Homme Révolté. If we want to translate it literally, we would say the revolting man, the man who is revolting, right? Or who has revolted, okay, or going through rebellion, because the point of the book is rebellion. And so he talks in this book, there's kind of, to me, two big themes of that book. The first one has to do with how rebellion is part of human instinct and human nature. It's kind of a universal driver in human beings that they want to revolt, they want to do something, stand up and rise against certain things in life. And this, in general, is that when they go through oppression, if they go through sufficient oppression, sufficient injustice, enough of it, their desire for dignity, their desire for justice trumps, and they rise against it. And they rise against it alone in certain ways, or they rise against it in groups in other ways. But all of that is, what we can call rebellion. And the point he's trying to make here, and this is the existential part, is that he's trying to show that this is not a political stance. Human beings don't do this, they don't rise up because they're taking a political position. This is an existential impulse, deep within the human being. Any human being would be acting in this way, or should be acting in this way. Okay, so he's writing, and it's a work of fiction, right? But this is how he gets his philosophy across. And a lot of the big writers do this. But then, so all of this is kind of the universal part, and this is what he's trying to explain. That's kind of one idea in the book. The main other idea in the book has to do with the intellectual, and how the intellectual fits into all of this. So it becomes a critique of the intellectuals and a critique of the ideas of the intellectuals, because he says at some point those ideas start to slip towards calling for violence and calling for things that go too far. They go to the extremes. And so intellectuals will tend to eventually justify anything, even if it's contradictory to their own principles. And it will go, and it will be accepted. Anything and everything can be justified by the intellectuals, and they do. And this is when their ideas go too far, and they turn violent, and the rebellion starts to take another shape. And of course, here he's alluding to people like Marx and Hegel and Nietzsche, and whose ideas as philosophers led to real revolutions and catastrophes and bloodshed and disasters in the world, right? But they were thinkers. They were just writing their books. They were thinking, analyzing, coming up with ideas, coming up with theories, and presenting them to the world. So what he's trying to do is to say that the rebellion is really good. It is something that matches and is aligned with human nature, but it should always remain within the constraints of what is in moderation and what respects human life. That's really the point that he's trying to get at, as opposed to, and this is his point because that's his lived experience, the rebellion slipping into totalitarianism, authoritarianism, tyranny. And then this is when something that was supposed to be good and coming from a good place within the human being starts to turn into something that should have been against its own principles. The reasons why you stood up in the first place was to get rid of something that you are now helping to create yourself. Okay, so you betray your own principles and ideas. And so he says, in short, the major thinkers are elites who are able to influence people, who have a lot of ability to make people change their minds and to rise and to do certain things, to the point where those people start to disconnect from their true humanity. So it's like they are manipulating them by using impulses within them, while at the same time disconnecting them and making them do things that are not part of their true human nature. They wouldn't have done those. And that's why those elites, those intellectuals are in fact very dangerous, right? Because their ideas can turn into all of this. So he says intellectuals are therefore dangerous and they cannot be followed blindly. That's kind of the second theme of this work specifically. So again, I think I'm drawing you a parallel to show you how a lot of those who have looked at the role of the intellectual, we might think, not knowing, going in about the thought, our assumption might be that intellectuals are amazing, we should have more of them, intellectuals are to be respected and followed, and their ideas should be studied and implemented. But there's a lot of cases where those who have given special attention to intellectuals have in fact been very critical of intellectuals. And they have said that a lot of the horrendous, horrific things of the world, the disasters and the mistakes and the crises, are in fact the result of intellectuals for all these reasons that we just mentioned. And so intellectuals can become very dangerous and we have to be very careful. And we're giving the reasons, and the reasons I think are more important for us to keep in mind to see what we do with all of this afterwards for ourselves. The last point, the last theme that I wanted to continue with, so inshallah I just leave it, I just mentioned it, I said, was engagement. And so this is the idea that to what extent should the intellectual be an engaged intellectual versus staying away from action? And what have these thinkers who have looked at this question said about it? Do they say the intellectual should be engaged? And we have already seen examples of engagement. What does engagement look like? Or not engaged? And we'll see that there's both. And what are the arguments of each? And we already know perhaps why. Some say do not be engaged, but there's even more, inshallah, we will look at it. But as we said, so now we're looking at kind of putting everything we said from the West, we're taking everything that we can to say there's three major themes that come out when we look at what has been said about intellectuals. The first one has to do with their involvement in power structures. The second one has to do with whether we should be open with open arms, completely following them, or more critical and skeptical of intellectuals. And the third one, inshallah, to come is to what extent should the intellectuals be engaged in real world, in society, or should they stay in their field and in their area, in their dimension of thought and ideas, and that's it? Or do we want them to be more engaged, as in taking action, being more activist, being more present and participating in society in all sorts of various ways? Let's stop here. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. Any questions, concerns, comments about any of this? تفضل. It's a very good question. They do not even all of them define the intellectual in the same way. So even within them, there is a bit of difference. Generally speaking, everyone agrees that the intellectual is the one who engages in intellectual activity and produces intellectual thought. Everybody agrees on that part. That's the common part. Who else falls in there? This is where there's a difference between them. So for instance, that's why we mentioned, like when there are differences in how they are defined, when these thinkers make a point to say this is an intellectual, this is not, we're mentioning it. So for instance, in the case of Saul, if someone is producing an output Generally speaking, I'll just say it this way. Generally speaking, in societies, most societies around the world, you would say, part of the intellectuals of society, for instance, are your engineers, because they are people who are thoroughly educated in their field. So he says, absolutely not. Engineers produce real material outputs in the world. I can't put them, because he wants to criticize those who don't. And so it wouldn't work for his model. So what do we care about all of this? What I care about is that I want to take his idea about those who only produce intellectual outputs, because that's relevant to me. Not whether I agree or disagree with his idea of an intellectual. Now that I have an example of what an intellectual may be, I'm interested more in the tool that this might give me, because it might be useful to me, Islamically speaking, or for my community, if I have people who fall in this category, that their only output is things that stay at this level, at the intellectual level, and yet we are giving them a lot of power and a lot of room and a lot of space to take a lot more decisions without the action that goes with it, and following blindly, as they say, and there's no real consequences. Maybe here we have a warning. Maybe here we have a reason to say, perhaps we should not organize our communities in this way. Someone who is completely immune from any, the consequences of their decisions, we should not be creating these types of situations, because they do not tend to end well, whether in our community or elsewhere. This is general human tendency, that you put someone in a position where there's no skin in the game, right? So they can make any decisions, any recommendations, and they do not have the expertise to back it up, or a demonstrated, background to back it up. Maybe we have to be careful about that. That's the part that I care about, right? Not the whole theory, because I'm not trying to apply their theory to me or to my community. I don't need that. I need the tools, and so I'm going from one to the other, because I'm going to be picking and choosing the tools that are going to be useful to us after, to say this is relevant. We can do something about this. This matches our ahadith, this matches our Quranic verses. That's what we're trying to do. Otherwise, excellent question. Yes.
When we define the intellectual, do we say that that part is not necessary for us to consider them an intellectual in the community, or do they need to be people who are well educated and influential in society at large?
If we want it to be technical, which we're not going to be doing here, okay? If this were going to be turned into a book, then I would go all the way. We have the documentation for it, but we're not going to go that far in our lectures, because it's going to require much more time to do. So we're keeping it broad so that it's applicable to our communities. But if you wanted to go in the technical sense, yes, we would need to distinguish and create categories of the intellectual that we're referring to. The issue that we have right now is that the Islamic discussion will not match 100% the Western discussion, even the word. So the word that is usually used in the, let's call it the Islamic literature, is al-muthaqqaf. Okay, and there are books about this. Al-faqih wal-muthaqqaf, al-qati'a bayna al-faqih wal-muthaqqaf, for instance. Okay, and I'll talk about this, and I will present what is meant by it, and we will define it in that way, and then you will see where it matches and where there is a difference. So it doesn't match entirely. Muthaqqaf does not entirely match the intellectual, right? There's a complete difference here. The muthaqqaf is someone who is cultivated or is cultured, right? Thaqafa is culture. Well, it's someone who is cultured. To be cultured, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're highly educated, that you've been exposed to culture, that you think in a certain way. You have thaqafa, you have culture, is very different than to say you went 16 years to university. You may have, but it's not a condition. And We are more interested in the reality of the community. Does it need to be someone who is in the elite? No. He tends to be focused on that. And what we want to say is anyone can become that. So we're going to draw the part that is relevant to us in that way. I don't know if I answered, but yeah. Yeah. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.